Good morning and welcome to Sunday Snacks
with Sam
and Ellie. Never the twice. Never the same
never
twice.
The same twice.
Good grief. Today we're here to talk to you about what we've both learned from older generations in our family. I know I've talked about my grandmother a lot, and Ellie has been reminiscing with me about her grandparents and her mom, which has been such an interesting, round of stories because we kind of put it together that my grandmother is actually
about the age that my mom would be.
Yeah.
They'd be about the same generation.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because when I talk to, or even I look at my husband's family, whose grandparents, one of his grandparents is still alive, his grandmother's still alive, and she's only now in her late 80s. And when my grandmother passed away in 2016, she was almost 95. So, So it's just an interesting dichotomy, like just like how that all pans out, just in comparison to families and how that is. Like I always have looked at it as I have an older family, and just because that's how my family versus my husband's family is, and then you have your whole family, and I loved hearing the stories that you were telling me about the different routines that your grandparents had.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. One of the thoughts that came to mind was one set of grandparents was more strict than the other. They lived on a small farm, and when you wanted something, you didn't go to the cupboard and grab a glass and get your glass of water. You asked if it was okay. It just was a formality that was expected. My other grandmother, when you arrived, she would point out that, the chip-chopped beef or ham was in the fridge, the buns are over here, the sodas are over here. Whenever you guys are hungry, just grab something. And today, there's so much focus on our kids kind of just being allowed to be. And I'm like, how do you learn to relate to people if you don't learn to just honor and respect those differences like in our grandparents? And so sometimes, they'll say, they're young. Well, my grandparents were like that from the time I was old enough to know they were different. and you didn't feel more or less loved by one or another. And interesting, in later years, some of the leniences that strict grandparent did become the stories I remember the most, because they were so out of character. So when they broke the rule, it was an event.
It was special.
Exactly. So I think even in terms of relating, that's how we learn to interact in the world. That is also partly missed because so many aren't growing up with grandparents and stuff, and how to behave and honor them and respect them. So, that family isn't quite the same.
No.
And it's not just now. That's been happening over since the industrial age, that change. But that's something that comes to mind and always intrigues me, that the stories that are the most fascinating for me are oftentimes the one with the grandparents who were the most strict.
Yeah.
Because then it was special.
Yeah.
So it's I think there's much to be gained by those differences in their routines, but they also had the routines established it's like how you knew everybody was getting along. You know what I'm saying?
A sense of normalcy.
Yes, exactly. And made it so if there was a house full of people, it worked. It wasn't, people weren't getting all upset and, because you were trampling on somebody else's territory. You just knew what the routines were. So I think that's one of the differences I see that I appreciate today when I'm around people who seem to respond to that. They don't try to take over your household or whatever. They respect those
boundaries.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you brought up earlier that I found really interesting was that these relationships weren't just within the family, they were within the community. And a lot of it came from front porch sitting.
Yes.
Or like where I grew up in Philly, it was you sat on the stoop. And I know
Yes.
you said
no, yeah, I was trying to think of that word. Yep.
You
Yep.
had one as well, and where I'd be playing in the street and my grandparents would be talking to their neighbors on either side on the front porch. And I even, when I wasn't with my grandparents, my mom and I had a front porch, but it was enclosed.
Mhm.
And I have been racking my brain since we were talking about all this, trying to remember, did we really ever talk to our neighbors from the front porch setting where I lived with my mom? And the answer is no. Like, we talked over the fences
Yes.
in the backyard. But the irony to that is that when we moved from Philadelphia and we only talked to either side of our house, we moved to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and my mom and dad had this beautiful front porch where you could put rockers and just, you could sit out there and drink iced tea or do whatever. What I picture as like,
Norman Rockwell.
Norman Rockwell, iconic Southern style living. My parents never did that. They rarely talked to their neighbors.
They were in the backyard.
They were always in the backyard. You had to invite someone in.
Yes.
To your personal space. It wasn't like how my grandparents were, where, they're all sitting outside chatting. Sometimes they're talking across the street because
somebody walked by and you
say
something,
hello.
they come up and sit on the steps and chat a while. Yeah.
It was definitely more of a community versus isolationism.
Yeah.
But with all that came more of an understanding. What I learned from my grandparents is you really make do with what you have. And if those people that came up the stairs were now there at dinner time, you didn't turn them away.
Right.
You, as weird as this might say today to a lot of people, you might add another cup of water to the soup or another can of sauce to, what your goulash or your pasta to make it stretch. And that's always been the thing, is like you make it stretch. Or maybe you weren't expecting them, so now you have salad and a little bit of pasta so that everybody gets a little bit of something.
And a veggie or something to just open it up a little bit.
To make more for everyone. And it was one of those things that, for me, with my grandparents, like, we were going through like a laundry list. Ironically, laundry was on the list. A laundry list of the things that I learned that you inherently learned from your mom, or I learned them more from my grandma, was more, and my grandfather, like canning and gardening and sewing and, composting. In the 80s, I was composting before it was really popular, because that was just something my grandparents did. It innately was part of my everyday life. Ironing was one of those ironic things that we were talking about that I don't like to do, especially unless I really just want to calm down, because it's one of those like really chill things I thought I would never do, that I didn't want to do because I was a modern woman. And then I realized, you know what? This is actually incredibly relaxing just to stand there, kind of like do.
And there's a wonderful satisfaction when you're done.
When they're pressed. Yes. And I'm like, wait.
It's like everything is like all bright and shiny
and fresh and all the things. But it's novel because, even though my mom hung out her laundry, I really learned hanging my laundry out from my grandparents, because we weren't always at home.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the time I was at my grandparents growing up, so I would help with their laundry all the time, hang it out, bring it in, fold it, and just having that, fresh air. And it's interesting because my next door neighbors now are amazed that I'm doing that with my kids and teaching my kids to hang their laundry out, because not just is it environmentally friendly, it keeps your clothes fresher, in my opinion.
I agree.
But they find it interesting because they have kids with children the same age as me. They're maybe a year or two off. And they're like, no, we're not hanging our clothes outside.
Yeah.
No, that's what the dryer's for.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's what the sun and the air is for.
Well, and what's really interesting is some of these developments where they have, what is it called?
An HOA.
Yeah.
Homeowners associations.
Right. Some of them you're not even allowed to hang them out.
Which I think is wrong.
Oh, I do too, but they've made it socially unacceptable.
Hey, if I want all my clothes to smell nice and fresh from the outside air, I think I should be allowed to do that. But, that's the reason why I went from living in a townhouse where I wasn't allowed.
Yes.
I was not allowed, but I went around the rules and I put the drying racks on my deck.
Yeah. Well, and I'm in a small apartment, and I hand wash a lot of my clothes, but I have a rack in my bedroom, and I turn a fan on when I can't open the door. And when I can open the door, I open the door because I'm in a kind of a commercial area where there are offices. So I don't think they'd like my rack out in the front yard.
No. I mean, I don't put my underwear on display for my neighbors. It's in my backyard.
Yeah. But it's but I still like that, and I've learned that they, if I turn the fan on, it's like having a little wind, and they dry. Very rarely do I have to press them.
Yeah, and they smell nicer, in my opinion. It doesn't matter how much fabric softener someone uses. I think still putting your clothes outside, and
they also don't get as staticky because they're not coming out of the dryer.
There you go.
Yeah.
I think that smell of like just sunshine, air. I don't know what all the science behind it is, but they just always smell better.
Ionization or something.
Something like that.
Like when it's raining.
I could ask my husband, but I'm not going to. So then I'll get a whole lecture.
We know what it is.
There's a whole lecture behind that. I don't really want. The chemical engineer in him will just be like, ooh, I can explain. I'm like, nope, thank you. But the whole point of our conversation here is that we really wanted you to really think about what are the things that you've learned from the older generations. It could be your parents, it could be your grandparents, your great-grandparents, if you're
neighbor.
Yeah, your neighbor, friends of families, that you learned, you adopted, and they're practical and they're actually really great in your everyday life that maybe somebody doesn't think about today. I would have never thought when I was a kid that I'd be baking bread regularly for my family. I just didn't think about it. Even though my grandmother did, it wasn't something that I thought I would do.
Exactly.
Because it was already available at the grocery store. Why would I waste my time? But in reality, I've learned it's not a waste of my time. It's way better for me. It's way better for my family. So what are those kind of oddball practical tips that you've learned from somebody else? Because we'd love to share them. We love to compile them, let everybody else know. Because
and we love the stories.
The stories are wonderful, and hearing them is just fabulous. So leave them in our comments. We can't wait to hear from you, and have a good one.
Have a great Sunday.
See ya.